Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, my name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our discussion this afternoon with Thomas Jacobson, a Holocaust survivor who will share his story with us. And afterwards, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. And just before we begin, I'm going to give a quick overview of our museum. For those who aren't familiar with us, Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure that future generations would always remember and learn from this tragic part of our history. And they did this at a time when most people were not yet willing to learn about the Holocaust, and as a result, many survivors were not yet willing to share their experiences. But thanks to the courage and foresight of this group of survivors, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. And we can't do the work that we do today without our survivor community. And so I'm pleased to welcome Thomas Jacobson today, who will be sharing his story for the first time through our museum. And afterwards, again, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A box. And this is also our last, for the time being, of our virtual Sunday Survivor talks that we've been having since we closed in June for construction. I'm pleased to say we will be opening again on Sunday, November 10th. So for those who are local, please come back to the museum starting next Sunday for our regular Sunday program. And we have in-person Holocaust survivor talks on many Sundays. And these talks are sponsored by Dr. Arnold L. Gilberg and family. And again, we're pleased to welcome everyone today. And thank you again so much for joining us today, Thomas, and for sharing your story with us. And you may begin.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very opportune time to talk about the Holocaust and remembering the Holocaust, given the turbulent times that we find ourselves in with the election coming up Tuesday. Fear of many people have turned toward authoritarianism in this country. Some parallels actually some people's minds to what happened in Germany and leading up to Hitler in 33 with the fall of the Weimar Republic and the threat that we have to our republic today. Uh, my talk is I was one of the youngest passengers on the St. Louis. Um, it starts, of course, Hitler became chancellor in 1933. Uh, April of 33, there was already a boycott put in place in Nazi Germany against Jewish merchants that affected my family. Uh, on my maternal side, my grandfather owned a department store in Insterburg, and my grandfather owned a haberdashery store in Pillau. Both of those establishments were affected by the Nazi Jewish merchant boycott that was put in place in April of 33, where Germans were encouraged not to shop at any Jewish-owned establishments. And that was the beginning of only what was going to become much more horrendous as the years went on. Uh, my grandfather, George Jacobson, that would be my father, Eric Jacobson's father. The family of my father, he had two sisters and his mother. They were all killed in the Spanish flu in 1918 in Germany. So actually, my father and his grandfather, they were on their own after 1918, uh, when the flu took the rest of the family. Um, on my maternal side, my grandparents, there was my mother Greta, and she had an older sister and her mother and father. Um, After April of 33 and the initial boycott of the commercial establishments owned by Jews, the next big step that the Nazis took against the Jews as they escalated pressure against Jews was the Nuremberg laws that were passed September 15th of 35. And those laws, the Jews lost citizenship, and it was the beginning of major measures that were taken against the Jews in terms of where they could be educated, where they could enjoy any of the public accommodations in Germany. Uh, it just became getting worse and worse and worse. My parents, after the Nuremberg laws, they determined that already Jews weren't going to be welcome in Germany. It was going to get worse under Hitler. And they made their application to get a visa to the United States. My grandfather on my mother's side, he had been a member of the German army in World War One. He believed in assimilation, as both sides of my family believed in assimilation. As far as the Jews into Germany, on my grandfather's side, my paternal side, he actually served on the Common Council in Pillow as a Jew. There were only two Jews in Pillow at the time. Uh, so after they made application to get the visa to come to the U.S., my grandparents, um, George, he felt he was too old to go, so he did not ask for a visa application. And my grandfather on my mother's side, he just felt that Hitler was an aberration. No one could predict what was going to happen down the road in terms of the Holocaust. He felt that it was going to blow over, and he just didn't see any reason that he should leave Germany, all of his friends, and his business. So he also, at that time, didn't choose to put in an application for a visa. Um, the average 1934 to 1937, during this period of time, uh, there were 7,000 visas that were actually handed out to the United States. That's all, just 7,000. Uh, there were approximately 18, 19,000 that were not used. And on a waiting list, it was about 80 to 100,000 people waiting to get visas. And the waiting list was 3 or 4 years. It was based on getting a visa in the United States. We had 1924, the National Origins Act or the Immigration Act that was passed, which tightened up uh, in terms of visas being allocated. And 2% of the total number of people of each nationality that came to the United States using the 1890 national census was the basis for how many visas were actually allocated for people to be able to utilize. Um, Now, I was born May of 38. The Evian conference, the big problem Jews were having during that period of time, Hitler was willing to let the Jews go. At that time, his policies were to drive the Jews out, make them lose all their assets, leave everything there, but they wanted the Jews out of Germany. Uh, the Evian, nobody wanted the Jews. No country wanted the Jews. The Evian Conference, which was held in July of 38, 32 countries came together to try and address the problem of getting some places the Jews could go to get out of Germany. And the United States, Roosevelt didn't even send a representative from the State Department. He sent a businessman, Maxwell Taylor. No country would open up their doors to additional Jews at that time. Uh, then came November 8th of 38 and November 9th of 38, which was Kristallnacht. Uh, that was when you had the Night of the Broken Glass. Numerous synagogues were burned to the ground. Many Jews were killed. Many businesses were destroyed. Many Jews were attacked. Hitler put into effect after Kristallnacht that the Jews had to pay for the damage that the Nazis caused with Kristallnacht. So there was a big tax levied on the Jews that they had to pay for the damage that was done to Kristallnacht. Uh, at that time, you had the SS. They put into effect that between the ages of 16 and 63, 30,000 Jews were rounded up and arrested. Uh, my father was among them. He was arrested on November 9th. In the morning, the SS came to the dorm. I was 5 months old at the time. My mother, she answered the door. My brother, my half brother, he's 5 years older than I am at that time. He would have been 6 years old. The SS just informed her that father had 5 minutes to get his things together and he was under arrest. Uh, he had to round up whatever, his toothbrush, whatever he could take with him, his medicine for his various medical conditions, and off they marched him to the railroad station. And my mother had no idea where he was being taken. After what she did, she had to go to the SS headquarters in Nuremberg. And can you imagine how brave my mother had to be at that time with a 5 months old in tow? My brother, he was shipped off to one of my grandparents to stay while she went with me to the headquarters of the SS in Nuremberg to find out what could be done and what was happening to my father, to her husband. And she was told that, euphemistically, they said he was being held for his own protection. And that the only way that he was going to get out was if she came back with proof that we were going to be leaving Germany, that we had to get out of the country. Um, 6 weeks later, he was released. Uh, my the reason he was released, it's really very opaque. The reasons and rationale how and why persons were released, some of it was through bribery of some of the Nazis in order to get out. There was really no reason given why he was released at that time, but he was released after 6 weeks. He came home in December of 38 and his physical condition had altered. His hair was all gray, his teeth were affected. He had lost a substantial amount of weight. My brother said that he left a young man and he came back an old man. Uh, and he was a mess, of course, psychologically and emotionally from what happened in Dachau. Um, Then we made the efforts to really get out of the country after that happened. We had a relative here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who was related to my father. The Ostermans, Fanny and Edmund Osterman, he owned a factory in Milwaukee, and they were fairly well to do. and they became our sponsors. The U.S. had a policy to immigrate here. You had to show that you weren't going to become a public ward, you weren't going to be on welfare, that you could support yourself, you wouldn't be a burden on people here in the United States. And she had to put an affidavit in that she was willing to do that and be our sponsor. As during that period of time, the United States, as you all know, was very isolationistic, which is one of our concerns about Trump's policies of not only wanting authoritarianism, but he's an isolationist. He, wants us not in the war as far as supporting Ukraine against the Soviet Union. Take us back to what the United States was like in the late 30s. Uh, in April of 39, a ad appeared from the owners of the Holland America line, and they were offering, and this was because of Hitler wanting this to be done. They owned that shipping lines at that time. That a ship was being made available for Jews to leave to go to Cuba, to Havana, May of 38. When my mother, father saw that ad, they immediately responded, and it was that particular ad that they were responding to where they then purchased the tickets on that Holland American line to St. Louis, which was the name of the boat, to go to Havana, Cuba. You had to get a visa to go to Cuba. It cost $540 to get a visa. There were two types of visas. There was a regular visa and there was a tourist visa. Tourist visa was a scam. And basically, the person that was in charge of giving out those visas in Cuba, that was sold for 200 and some dollars, and it was called a tourist visa. And that was what we bought. And it was packaged with the shipping costs of what the Holland America line was charging. Not only did you have to buy the visa for 540, but then you had to have the package that you had to buy through St. Louis with the tourist visa, another 500 and some dollars. But that's how you had that's what you had to pay to get out. And that was what we did. So the fare was actually 1.5 times what it would cost just to go to Havana uh, from Holland, from Germany. Interestingly enough, to pay 1.5, that doesn't bode well for the thought of that voyage being completed one way, that you were having to pay for half of what it would cost to come back again. Uh, so we left on the St. Louis, and it left Hamburg May 13th of 39. The person responsible in Cuba for issuing those tourist visas had not shared that money with the person, Brew, that was head of Cuba at that time. So Brew passed a decree while we were en route from Germany, Hamburg, to Cuba. Uh, that decree invalidated the tourist visa, that you had to have a regular visa, pay another $540 for that visa. Only on the boat, and prop 950 Jews were on the St. Louis approximately, and only 24 had actually a regular visa. Everybody else had that tourist visa. So when we got to Cuba, we couldn't land. Uh, at this time, I'm going to read to you a letter that my mother wrote to our sponsor And this letter was written by my mother to our sponsor, July of 39. And this is when we had already landed in Holland, which I'll explain how that all occurred, that we ended up in Holland. But this letter describes, from her perspective, the voyage of the St. Louis. The voyage to Cuba was wonderful, but what followed was exciting and harassed our nerves to a high degree. Our cousin in London had paid for the permits $540. The government of Cuba had taken the money and refused the landing. We are afraid the money will be lost to us. We lay for 8 days in the harbor of Havana. Our friends there came daily by boat to our steamer to see us, but nobody was allowed to get on board, and then followed the return that we shan't forget never. For one day, we cruised slowly in front of Miami. We saw the wonderful beach and the beautiful hotels, but unfortunately, we were not received by America. From there, we St. Louis went uh, to Canada, and they were denied the opportunity to land in Canada. We could not. Mackenzie, who was the Canadian Prime Minister, he refused to allow the St. Louis to land in Canada. Uh, in addition, getting back to my mother's letter, after being refused admittance, and by the way, there was a committee established by passengers on the St. Louis during this time period when we were not being allowed to get off in Cuba, couldn't get off in Canada. Uh, and this committee sent telegrams to FDR. Two telegrams went to Roosevelt asking for amnesty, allowing us to land. And he refused to respond to those telegrams. Uh, after we were denied Canada, we then took, my mother wrote, we took a course toward Europe and feared being brought back to Hamburg. After many anxious days had passed, there was at last the delivering news uh, that England, France, Belgium, and Holland had declared that they would take us in. You cannot imagine our happiness. After wandering for 5 weeks, the MS St. Louis at last landed at Antwerpen, and from there, about 200 passengers were brought here. Uh, this was High Platte, which is where the immigrants had to go. That was Holland. That was the camp, um, and we were taken there by a little steamer. We had relatives in London, but we were actually taken to Holland. Now, uh, the breakdown, we had Britain taking 287, France took 224, Belgium took 214, and the Netherlands, where we went, took 181. And that was arranged through Morris Troper and the American Jewish Committee, the joint, the joint. Um, those were where the various passengers landed. We landed then in Antwerp in July of 39. Now we had to wait once we got to the Netherlands to get out of that camp to be able to book passage to the United States. That took 4 months before that was finally put together. And we left in January of 1940, uh, and we arrived in the United States in February of 1940. The boat was camouflaged. It was called the Vendame. There was the problem, one of the problems, aside from having, we had to get the money again to buy passage on the boat to get out of the Netherlands. Getting that money together, the other problem was that boats that were leaving Holland for America had to go through the English Channel, and the German submarines were uh, destroying ships uh, at that period of time, and many lines didn't want their good boats to be exposed to that risk that they were going to be submarined. And so we had to wait until we got this tanker that we were put on. And the crossing at the Atlantic was horrendous. My brother remembered she was throwing up all night, and it was just a horrible voyage. But we ended up in Southampton, England, where our relatives did try to get on the boat to visit us, but they couldn't get on the boat either. Just like in Cuba, the people that wanted to visit the boat to St. Louis when it was at the harbor to visit friends that were on the boat that they were related to, they were not allowed to do that. Couldn't get on the boats. Um, so again, we were very, very fortunate to get out, period. I mean, May of 1940, Hitler invaded Holland. And all the Jews that were still in the camps that we were at High Platte and Westerbork, they were then shipped east. Uh, and then what happened? 527 were trapped when Germany conquered Western Europe. And of that number, 287 survived and 254 died. So on the St. Louis, of the 900 and some passengers, 287, 254 died. And had Roosevelt given us amnesty, nobody would have gotten killed. We would have all been saved. Uh, the period after we got to the United States, of course, my grandparents were still in Germany. So my parents had to deal with having their parents still in Germany under Hitler, where things were really heating up and getting much worse for Jews with deportations, with ghettos. Uh, George died in 1942. Um, that was my paternal grandfather. My maternal grandparents, David and Eva, they were deported in June of 42. Um, from Insterburg to Minsk. Now, we don't know if they ever got there. Uh, Either they were murdered en route, they were stopped in a forest, all the Jews had to disembark, and of course, they were shot in the forest, or they were murdered in Minsk. We know they were murdered, but we just don't know the actual facts of how that was done. Uh, In January of 2019, I got a letter from a woman. Her name was Amelia Herman. It turns out that her grandmother had worked for my grandfather George in his haberdashery store during the period 1900 to 1910, literally as a member of the family. And she was interested in writing a book about our family and her family. So we began uh, ultimately, we began a correspondence. At first, I was a little reluctant. I didn't want anything to do with Germany. Uh, but I had curiosity about my family, and I decided she would do the research, that I would engage with her. And we've been doing this for 5 years. Uh, and much of what was uncovered in terms of the family was a result of her research. Uh, the couple letters here I want to read to you because I think they really give you an idea of these first person accounts of persons that actually lived the experiences uh, of how horrendous it really was. This is from April of 1941. It's a letter, Joseph Wilkowski, who is the head of the district community in Insterburg. And he gave a obit on this particular day, April of 41. And he wrote this: when the district synagogue in Insterburg made its preparation May 22 of 38 and celebrated the day of commemoration of 100 years of existence for the temple. Uh, Numerous guests of honor from provincial communities in the house of God were present for this commemoration, but no one suspected that the year of 1938, when they had their 100th year celebration, that at that time, that would mean that year was the year of its demise. Because on November 10th of 38, Kristallnacht, 6 months after this celebration, it was the morning between 3 and 4 o'clock that the beautiful house of worship, the site of 100 years of Jewish life in the top of Insterburg, went up in flames. It was destroyed with all that it contained of memorial plaques and other memorabilia from the 100 years of its existence. He ends up his letter by talking about just a tiny remnant of members of the stock of the former temple uh, was still in existence at that time. Uh, they were holding services on the Sabbath and on feast days, and they were led by the former head of the Presbyterian Assembly, David Simon, and that's my grandfather, uh, in a prayer room. And he ended up, of course, how long this little remnant will be able to continue, form a Jewish unity is in your hands. He says this about God. And you great exalted God, have mercy on the Jewish people. That's my grandfather that he was talking about, was still doing with the small Jewish community that was left Paris after Kristallnacht had destroyed the temple. Then there was another letter from Elisa Schwernberger, and this was a letter that she wrote in 1968. And she was being questioned, she was a historian, she was being questioned about what happened to the Jews in Insterburg in the 40s. All I know about the treatment of the Jews in Insterburg in the early 1940s is that they were employed in garbage collection. At 5 o'clock in the morning, they had to line up and they had to sweep the streets. They had to empty the carts on a rubble dump near the waterworks. It was a filthy job, and only one of the supervisors had any human compassion. All of the rest made it very difficult for the older people. And then she wrote this: once I saw a Jewish woman, a Jewish column, sweeping in front of the town hall, and Mrs. Simon from Shakian and Shimon apparently had a heart attack. And that was my grandmother. Uh, She was leaning exhausted against the town hall beside the old market. People passed by silently. No one could help. Last thing that I want to talk about before we get to any questions you might have is the role of FDR as far as the Jews were concerned during this period. Uh, in the 30s, of course, for refugees, he did very little. Only after Kristallnacht, when he had the ambassador recalled, other than that, he did nothing. Uh, you had the Olympics in 36. Uh, all the athletes went. The Jews weren't allowed to participate, even though Brundage said they would be able to. Uh, and it was just like nothing was going on. They went to the Olympics in Nazi Germany and participated. Uh, there was a group that was Israelis that were in the United States, the Peter Bergson group. They attempted to get Roosevelt to be more aggressive in terms of a refugee policy for the Germans, the Jews that were still in Germany during that period of time. Um, he organized some Orthodox rabbis that went with a petition. Roosevelt wouldn't see him. Henry Wallace he sent, and he wouldn't accept the petition. Uh, there were issues about why wasn't Auschwitz bombed? Uh, and the issue that I think there's the least dispute is about the fact that we just never utilized the number of visas that were available under the restrictive conditions that existed in the United States at that time, as far as immigration was concerned. There were a number of visas that weren't used, that could have been used. And Roosevelt had his buddy in charge, Huey Long, this is Long, I can't think of his first name. Um, he uh, sent a memo to all of the foreign uh, people from the U.S. When visas were inquired about, just delay, delay, delay. Uh, it wasn't until 1944 when the War Refugee Board was finally put together. Over 100,000 Jews were saved, but the Jews in Hungary, they weren't saved in 44. So I am critical of the policies. Roosevelt not giving amnesty on the St. Louis and not doing anything, all of the visas that could have been issued to people that were desperate to get out of Germany during a period of time. So let's sort it up to any kind of questions any of you might have at this time.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing today. And we do have some time for questions. So one question we have is when your father was arrested, did the Nazis give any sort of explanation or reasoning?
Not at the time they arrested him, but they did tell him mother was for protective custody. I believe again, Himmler had put out the decree that these Jews between 16 and 60 should be arrested, and that really get the ones that've got the money, the wealthy ones, arrest them, so they could extort money from the Jews. I mean, they had an alienation policy where after Kristallnacht, Jews couldn't run their businesses anymore. They had to be a non-Jew that would be running their businesses. Um, so my grandparents, they lost their businesses, they lost their insurance policies, but to my knowledge, there was no reason given why they arrested him other than he was a Jew, and they were rounding the Jews up.
And what happened to your grandparents?
Well, as I indicated, George, he died in 42. He died a natural death. The grandparents on my mother's side were deported and murdered. Uh, we did a application. Germany put in effect in 54 uh, a mechanism where you could bring an action in German courts if you had lost your insurance policies or if you had lost property. Uh, and we brought an action on behalf of my mother and her sister uh, in 54 for insurance policies that my grandfather had. 20% of the value of those insurance companies was paid after that hearing. We did not get the money for the department store. Uh, my grandfather, when he could no longer run the business, he sold it to his employees, and they claimed he sold it to his employees. Of course, he couldn't take the money out of the country. He never left the country. And of course, all that money then ended up back with the Nazis. And we tried to say it was a forced sale and that they should have to compensate us for the loss of the department store, but they wouldn't entertain that. That was through the claims conference. Um, so that was, in addition to, uh, at that hearing, it was determined that my grandfather had been murdered and had lost his life. He had worn the Jewish star from the time that they made it mandatory, the Nazis. So for loss of freedom, they paid him some money to my mother and her sister both for their mother and their father. For we also asked for the insurance policy money again, and we did get full payment on one. They made a mistake. We kept the money. Uh, in addition, they gave my money a widow's pension because my father died at a young age from some of the after effects of what happened when he was in the concentration camp. So we did get restitution from Germany. That was quite controversial if you accepted that money. You know, in Israel, they consider that blood money. My own view is any pennies that you can get out of the German people for what they did to the Jews in the 30s, it wouldn't be enough. You could never bring the people back for the horrendous things that happened to them during the Holocaust.
Thank you. Do you have any other family letters?
Yes, I do. I have telegrams, I have correspondence, I have the passports. I have a folder that I keep all that information in. So I do have some of the original documents. My mother took a trunk. She was clairvoyant enough to bring something, a lift that was sent out with many of these documents that were sent out of Germany, which you could still do that to London, where she had her relatives, and they kept that for us. And then we got that after we came to the United States.
Thank you. How old were you when you arrived in the Netherlands?
I would have been a year. I was one of the very youngest on the boat. I have no recollection, of course. My brother, he remembers some things, or he did remember some things of the voyage. Uh, but he was very young as well. So I don't think he remembered too much of what went down.
Can you share a little bit about your parents' lives in the United States?
My father, he started working at the factory that his sponsor owned. That was during the war. And my mother started a business called Kitty Fashions, where she made high-end children's clothes. And then she would sell at the stores like Macy's and to uh, women's apparel store, children's stores, high-end children's clothes. Um, and then he worked at, he started out after he learned the language. He went to night school so he could really speak the language well. And then he went to work at J.C. Penney Company. When they found out he was a Jew, they fired him. So he ended up going to Sears. And then when Penny's changed their managers, policies. He went back to Penny's. He became the top salesman in the J.C. Penney chain. And of course, the busy day of the year after Thanksgiving, he had a heart attack right there at work and died in 1950. Two, he was 50 years old. Uh, my mother, she kept that business going, and then she ended up working at a high-end farm store. She was quite an amazing woman, my mother. I mean, she not only did she have to take the reins of the family after my father was taken to Dachau and the traumatic trauma that he was going through during that period, trying to get out of Germany. When he had left Dachau, they all had a sign, the inmates at Dachau, that if they didn't get out of Germany in 6 months, they would all be picked up and taken back, and whatever would happen to him. So he had enormous pressure. So she actually took charge of what was going on with the family during that period of time. And when we got to this country, she continued to work. She raised two boys, always was independent, uh, self-supporting, and always supported us no matter what. She was just an amazing woman.
Thank you. And when did she pass away?
She was 92, so she would have died about 10 years ago, maybe longer. She made it to 92.
Did your parents ever, how much of this did your parents share with you throughout the
Yeah,
years?
that's an interesting point that you made earlier as well, where you're talking about the origins of how your organization got together and when the Jews that were survivors chose to put this organization together to keep talking about what happened so that we don't forget the Holocaust, uh, and that people have it and know really what happened. There's so many deniers, so many people don't believe what went on during the 30s. Uh, they would, my mother, my my father and I was so young, I never really engaged, and he never talked about what happened in Germany. He wouldn't talk about it. It was just too traumatic for him, and my mother as well. But interestingly enough, my son Scott, he did a interview of his grandmother while she was still living. And in that interview, which we have a copy of the tape, where she talks about what went on in Germany a little bit, not a lot, but she did talk about how she first found out about the death camps, Auschwitz and that kind of thing after the liberation of Auschwitz. That was when they first knew how awful it was what the Nazis did to the Jews. Um, but she also talked about the fact that her parents decided finally they did want to immigrate out of Germany, and they made application to get out uh, in the early 40s. But when the war broke out in 41, September, it was impossible, and you couldn't get out anymore. They were going to be going through Italy and then to Cuba, and then they wanted to get a visa to come to the United States. Whether we could have put all that together, at least they were willing to do it, but it couldn't happen anymore after what happened when the war broke out. Remember, Hitler, he, interestingly enough, in January 30th of 39, he gave that speech where he talked about in Munich that if the United States started the war, uh, that the Jews would be annihilated. Uh, the Jews were to blame for the United States then entering the war and causing the war, and that would be the justification for their uh, annihilation. Uh,
How has being a Holocaust survivor affected you in your life?
well, of course, it made a huge impression on me. By the time I got through high school and into college, I pretty much was aware of what had happened to my family. Uh, And I decided I would go to law school. And it was the reason I became a civil rights lawyer. I opened up the first integrated law firm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, back in 1962, May. And I represented all of the civil rights hellraisers in Milwaukee. Uh, the housing marches, demonstrations against clubs that discriminated against blacks and against Jews, uh, de facto segregation. And of course, I ended up my career with very controversial representation of victims of Jeffrey Dahmer, where I got the money for what Jeffrey Dahmer did to their families, loved ones, where he had to pay substantial money for what happened. So my career was as a result of what what happened to my family. I never again that I was always a fighter for people's human rights and dignity from the beginning of my career to even through today.
Thank you so much. Um, what was your early life like in the United States? I know you mentioned that your father passed away at a young age. What was your life like assimilating into the United States, and growing up here?
Well, the early years were like pretty much like every youngster. I mean, I remember my father would take my brother and I out to baseball games. We had Orchard Field. We had a minor league baseball team in Milwaukee. We'd sit in the bleachers and he'd give us a hot dog and a Coke and we'd watch the doubleheader. And then on Sunday in the family, we would always go to a German restaurant called Mater's, which was a very famous restaurant in Milwaukee. Wiener Schnitzel, and my mother loved torts and uh, Viennese kind of food, and we would do that on Sunday. My father, he loved Betty Grable. We would always go see a Betty Grable movie. Uh, After the earlier years, once my father died, I was 13 at the time. Then I went to work, so I really had to help support the family, contribute. So I worked as a janitor's assistant, and I worked as a on a farm in the summer, working, doing chores and that kind of thing, and the and selling shoes. As I worked my way through school. I was uh, a very good salesman, made good money, and I was able to get my tuition for college and law school paid for by working. But I had to work a lot. So there really wasn't much of a social life that I had. Also, I was uh, pushed forward a grade when my parents bought a half a house in a suburb because they wanted us to have a better education than we were getting in the city. And that put me behind as far as any kind of social uh, life was concerned because I was the youngest in the class and I just wasn't there yet. So it took quite a while for me to catch up. But we caught up in college, so everything worked out fine. But we had a very wholesome and a very close family. You know, we belonged to temples. Uh, my brother was bar mitzvah. I wasn't. I was confirmed. Uh, but we had a good family life, but it was hard because we had no money. You know, you come back, all you could leave Germany was with 10 Reichsmarks. That wasn't even $10. You had to leave everything else in Germany. And the lift that we had all our clothes and everything packed to take out of Germany, that never got out of the port because the war started and everything was closed up by the time we were ready to get out. So we had absolutely nothing. Our sponsors really came through for us. But my father was hardworking. And we paid everybody back and got on our feet. And I mean, really, it's when you think about it, it's quite a country. I mean, here I come with nothing, and I became quite a successful civil rights lawyer. And I always worked independently. I never worked for anybody else. I always felt that I wanted to be on my own.
Thank you. In the 1960s and 70s in Milwaukee as a civil rights lawyer, did you experience anti-Semitism?
Oh, there's lots of things. I mean, there was not only my father getting uh, fired from Penny's because he was Jewish. Then once I was uh, working as a lawyer uh, in Madison, there was a swastika painted on the pier of Tower View by the fraternity next door. I was elected to be head of all of the Wisconsin Civil Rights Organization for students. And we brought a complaint to the president uh, asking that uh, the university throw this fraternity off campus, that they had actually had a float in a homecoming parade colored red, which was the same color as the swastika paint that was on the pier of this tower. He sang Jew, Dirty Jew. When Hillel had a cornerstone laying ceremony, there's a prank. They sold a cornerstone, so there was no cornerstone for the ceremony. And I wanted them to throw them off campus unless they delivered who put the swastika on the pier. They took the position that we had to identify who it was. And it reminded me of, the insurance companies for the Holocaust survivors. I wanted to get insurance money from the policies of the Holocaust victims that had died in Germany because of what the Nazis did. And they said, well, you either come up with the policies or you have to uh, come up and make the application if you took the policy. Well, how could everybody was dead and the policies were gone? Eisenstadt, Stuart Eisenstadt from Clinton's administration put together then that the insurance companies had opened their books and it would show who they'd issued policies to. And that's how my grandfather's name had come up with one policy that we got paid for by mistake. Uh, that That's what I wanted at the university. They wouldn't do it. So there were lots of examples of anti-Semitism in Milwaukee. Remember, that was a big German community. There was a big Bund there in their 30s. Uh, so you had a big German population and lots of sympathy in Milwaukee for the Nazis up until they went to war against the United States.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. To conclude, and I know you alluded to this a little bit at the beginning of your talk, what message would you like your audience to take away from learning your family story today?
They'll stand up and speak out, never be silent, never again. That's a simple message. You've got to call it out. You've got to put yourself on the line and make your views be heard and speak out. Uh, don't tolerate any kind of anti-Semitism, anti-Black feelings, any anti-Hispanic, any feelings against the gay community, any, I know this country is becoming very conservative about the issues on immigration. Uh, but we're a nation of immigrants. Immigrants have contributed greatly to the greatness of the United States as a country in the world. And you need to be aware of freedom. It's not free. You got to constantly be vigilant. It's like we keep talking about, I think it was Franklin that said, we're a democracy as long as we can keep it. Uh, and we're being tested in this election. Get out and vote. You know what the issues are. You know who believes in freedom and who believes in non-discriminatory policies and wants people to be treated dignity, humanity, has the awful rhetoric that's divided the country. So get involved, get everybody involved, get everybody to vote on Tuesday. It's critical. We could lose our democracy on Tuesday. Uh, it's important for all of us. Speak out. Don't let it happen again. Fight for freedom. It's a big, big price you pay if you don't have it. Just like what happened to the Jews in the 30s. That's a good lesson for you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And I want to thank you all again so much for tuning in today and for listening. And again, this is our last, for the time being, our last virtual Sunday speaker talk. Since we are opening again on November 10th. So those who are local, please join us starting November 10th for our regular Sunday afternoon programming. Again, Sundays at 3 o'clock at the museum. We always have either a Holocaust survivor speaker or another program of some sort. And we hope to see everybody um, at the museum. And again, thank you again so much for sharing your story today.
Thank
And I
you
want to
for
thank
inviting me.
our audience for being so engaged and for
Doing great work. Keep it
listening.
up.
So thank you so much for doing this. And of course, we look forward to having you, well, inviting you back to share your story more at the museum. And again, thank you to our audience. Wishing everybody a good day and good week ahead. Thank you.